More analysis, we can cross now to Mark Garnett, who's a senior lecturer in politics at Lancaster University in the UK. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Clearly, the Conservative Party disappointed by this outcome, a gamble that didn't pay off. Why do you think things went so badly wrong for them?
This is a campaign that you could look back on and say was doomed from the start. When Mrs. May announced that the unexpected election was scheduled for June the 8th, took everyone by surprise, and immediately the opinion poll suggested it would be a very easy victory. It would be the equivalent of a penalty kick in football for Mrs. May. But from the very outset, there were questions about why she was calling this election. And there is one thing about the British public: they tend not to like contests which are called without any obvious reason. And the stated reason, as you've mentioned, was to strengthen Mrs. May's hand in negotiations with the EU. But then it became very clear that the EU already had its negotiating position in place, and really they weren't bothered about the result at all. And so it became, it looked as if it was an opportunist election. And when you call an election on a prospectus which people don't really believe and feel uneasy about, then it's easy for things to go wrong. Mrs. May made sure that things went wrong and proved herself also to be not a natural campaigner, whereas her predecessor as Prime Minister David Cameron made mistakes but then found the right words to get himself out of those mistakes until he made the fatal one of calling the referendum. But until then, he'd really always been good at the right phrases. Mrs. May, in her speeches during the campaign, was not only wooden in the way she delivered those slogans, but also the slogans were so uninspired in themselves. She talked about reigniting the British spirit in the last day of the campaign. Well, the Conservatives have been the leading party in office for the last 7 years, so who put the flame out, or who took away the British spirit? It could only really recently be the Conservative Party. So she proved a really terrible campaigner, and since the election, really things have gone from bad to worse. She seems not to have even registered the fact that this is a humiliation for herself. She almost seems to be talking as if somehow the electorate has let herself and her party down. And so really we're in a constitutional mess and a political mess, and instead of seeing a way out of it, I think now things are even more murky than they were when the exit poll suggested that it was going to be a hung parliament.
Okay, there's lots of aspects to go through. Let's just talk quickly about the DUP. And let me ask you, what's your feeling about how that's going to work out, their part in Mrs. May's coalition government?
Well, there are two explanations here. The first explanation is that when it became clear that our electoral system was no longer delivering secure majorities to a single party, it was designed to do that, but now it doesn't because it doesn't fit our electorate anymore. Then the people in Whitehall in London produced a series of scenarios for coalition deals and deals of various kinds. And I would imagine that all of these deals have been war-gamed since 2010, when there was a coalition between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. So one explanation is that as soon as this result became apparent, that these people in London contacted Mrs. May and told her that really the only way to go forward in this, the arithmetic of this situation, was to try to get a deal with the DUP, because no other deal is at all possible. There is no other conceivable government in sight on the arithmetic of these figures. So on this interpretation, Mrs. May is doing her duty as a servant of the Constitution and trying her best to give some stability. Obviously, if it looks unstable in Britain for days and weeks ahead, then the markets are going to take a very dim view. So you could say that she's almost taking these hits which are falling on her because of her feeling of public duty. I'm afraid the other interpretation is that she has lost all sense of political judgment, and I'm afraid that has to be said. In 1974, Edward Heath tried to make a deal with the Ulster Unionists to keep him in power, but that wasn't in a scenario where there was something so important as Brexit impending. What it seems, the other explanation is that Mrs. May has felt that somehow things went wrong which weren't her fault and weren't the party's fault, and that the country is still, in fact, desperate for a May-led government and a hard Brexit, and that she's really entitled, therefore, to take any route to make sure that this happens. Now, if that scenario is true, I think we really are in probably the most serious direct political crisis since the 1970s.
OK, and of course, Mrs May not the only loser of the evening, although she has managed to get this coalition together. The Scottish Nationalist Party, another big loser of the night. What's your reading into that? And where does that leave aspirations for an independence vote, do you think?
This election has been fascinating because there's a big story and there's so many little subplots, and these little subplots are in fact quite important. And you can see one thing about the DUP as a partner for the Conservatives in office is that this puts new question marks over the position in Northern Ireland, another part of the Union which obviously has had terrible troubles in the past, but it's by no means certain that those troubles are completely over, and this could be another little spark which causes problems in Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, in Scotland, you might say, one part of the Union seems to have decided it doesn't want to have another referendum on independence in the immediate future. And the SNP, again, this is about the quality of our politicians. Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party, the First Minister in Scotland, has immediately just accepted that obviously the Scottish people felt they don't have an appetite for an election and for a referendum, and that was a big factor in the setback. So what she's done is taken it on the chin and moved on, and still is the largest party in Scotland. So I think that situation has calmed down, but it's almost like somebody trying to lay a carpet. As soon as you get one part in the corner of a room flat, then you look behind you and you can see there's another part of the carpet which is unravelling or is sticking up, and you have to deal with that. And that, I'm afraid, is a situation that's partly been triggered by Brexit in the United Kingdom, but also is just inherent in what is a very difficult country to govern. And Mrs May doesn't seem to register the enormity of the task ahead of her. I'm just hoping, as I say, that usually the British Constitution finds ways of sorting out all sorts of messes. This is a very big mess, and as long as the people involved keep their heads and behave responsibly, then I can see that it will be resolved in a matter of weeks, if not of days.
OK, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Mark Garnett, a senior lecturer in politics at Lancaster University. Thank you so much.